Hey, how's it going, everybody? So, I just wanted to take some time to talk about peaceful parenting and the issues that surround it, and especially people's criticisms as relate to it, because there's so many misconceptions about it, and so many people who are just so emotionally hurt or dysfunctional that they can't really absorb what it means to be a peaceful parent because there's too many psychological barriers in the way. And so I want to kind of break down the background to this and break down some of the common critiques that people have with peaceful parenting. So the kind of first background here is the ethical stance. That is, what are parents doing to children and why? So we're talking about spanking, especially in the context of peaceful parenting. We're talking about adults who are hitting small, helpless children, especially toddlers. It's probably the most common spanking bracket. And they're using this as a form of teaching. Essentially, it's a kind of lesson, because the whole idea of spanking is a parent wants a child to either do or not do something, and sometimes more often not do something. And so they hope that the pain that is inflicted by spanking leads to a change in behavior. And this subject has been studied at length by Murray Strauss. And in this context of the study, there is a longitudinal analysis that has been done on spanking and the effects thereafter. And many of the variables have been controlled for, and the results speak to a strong connection, a strong correlation between frequency of spanking and later antisocial behavior. And I don't mean that generically. I mean outward violence toward other people, breaking, hurting, damaging property or bodies of others. So this is just one of the noted effects, and the reason why this effect is there is because spanking leads to an activation of the primitive brain, the amygdala. And when that's activated, there's a fight or flight response that comes about because of the fear and the tension, the stress of being hit. And if this happens more and more frequently, eventually a young person with conflicting situations reaches a point where they go to an extreme. Either they shut down, they are unable to critically think because they're so used to feeling the threat of looming physical violence, or they react violently because they don't want to be themselves hit, so they have outbursts because they can't get their emotional wants and needs met. They're afraid they're going to be shut down violently, and it tends to drive young people toward those two ends. So with that in mind, that spanking causes psychological trauma, and this can be somewhat measured in terms of behavior later on in life that involves hurting others' bodies or properties, we can kind of understand that spanking in and of itself is not really that great of a thing in the long term, in terms of the outcome of what happens to kids. And this really kind of shocks people, I think, because they only see the manifestations in the immediate when a child seems to be obedient or well behaved, right? The spanking leads to an extinguishing of the behavior in the moment. The child is no longer nagging by saying things or grabbing something or touching or going somewhere they were told not to. And so parents say, oh, look, spanking worked. They stopped doing this thing. And that's a serious dilemma there, because someone says, well, see, it worked, but they don't look at the actual inception of how that took place, and they don't have a compared to what of what could be better, more ethical, and have less both immediate physical pain and later on pain that is psychological, that leads to behaviors that hurt others down the road. And because a lot of people don't have these tools, they can't really see a way out. They see the spanking as just something that, that's what they got to do. It's their only way to get peace around the house, or this or that, because they just don't have the tools. And it's not surprising. The history of violence against young people especially is enormous. we're talking about a history of child sacrifices, rapes, abuse, torture. Human history is littered with young people being treated like trash or like property. And that has effects later on in life. It has measurable effects, of someone who is abused. Later on down the road, they become themselves a part of that cycle of abuse and abuse others. And what happens here that, kind of throws people off is they're not able to see everything wholly in a compared to what, because not everybody immediately, when they grow up, becomes violent. It's not a 1-for-1 ratio where, if you're just spanked once, now all of a sudden you're going to go and, beat women or something. And that's because you have a totality of a childhood. And you can have what is an otherwise healthy childhood with lots of love and affirmation, physical attention with hugs and kisses, verbal praise and support, and a parent who maybe even spanks just rarely, and they try to not be angry, which is, kind of psychopathic if you think about it, but they try to not be angry when they spank, right? They can still have spanking, but not necessarily have a child who grows up and they themselves are like misanthropes who hate people and this or that. So, you can't just look at the concept of these harms in isolation. You have to look at it through and through with childhood and all the experiences that happen to a child. And when you do that, then you can kind of put together the picture and understand better that, childhood is not just a singular thing. There's a lot of elements that go into how a child is treated, how parents treat children, how they're, deemed worthy of respect and so forth, how they're communicated with when there is conflict. There's so many elements to it. But from what we can see based on longitudinal research, there is clearly a deleterious breaking down of the child's mind and their ethical compass when spanking is especially used without any kind of ethical guidance and vulnerable communication. And just on its own, it doesn't really communicate or fix the underlying problem. So if you want to really understand what peaceful parenting is, you have to move away from hyperbole. And of course, the second that someone says, well, if you're just saying that, you want to be a peaceful parent and spanking's not the solution, you just want entitled brats or something, something of that nature. And, these are fears of people who just have no idea about how they can be more ethical communicators and how they can be proactive parents. They grew up very often themselves being spanked and they think, well, it worked for me, so, I'm here, I'm okay. But they don't realize the lack of critical thinking or the trauma that has taken place because of that. Because they don't have another childhood to walk through. It's hard to be like, I can go back in time and replicate my childhood. It's just not going to happen. What we can do is we can look at the examples across many different peoples and cultures and experiments among families and see, okay, well, what can be done? And when we do that, and we don't work in hyperboles, we can start to see that there is a way to help children be non-violent in their expressions later in life, especially by being proactive with communication, by setting healthy boundaries with children, being direct, giving options, offering empathy, not shutting down emotions right away by saying, I'm just going to hit you if I don't like what you're saying, or I don't, like the noises you're making in a moment. There are ways to work around that. And doing that takes a lot of hard work. A lot of people are afraid to tackle that because they're worried about the difficulties and the patience it requires. But if you really, love your kids, or if you, this could apply to any other relationship technically, if you love anybody else, and you want to treat them with decency, respect, and build empathy and reasoned communication, you can't resort to just hitting them every time you think they're doing something that you don't necessarily like or makes you emotionally uncomfortable. And, with that in mind, some people will then say, well, are you saying there's no consequences or punishments either? And that's just not true either. A lot of people associate the idea of punishment or consequence with having to hit a child. And that's just not true at all. There are many ways to have consequences with taking away something that is fun or activity that's good, without having to resort to hitting. And a peaceful parent is someone who gives a child a childhood worth, living. It doesn't mean, you have to be rich and give them lavish things. It just means that you're making opportunities to have fun, to have engaging experiences out in the world together, and there's something worthwhile to take away or use, as leverage as a consequence. And there's many other, tactics too that parents use, but that's a common one that people often forget about because they're just so used to the idea of, I need to cause pain or I need to be retributive. And it's just not true for young children who are themselves discovering their existence, discovering how their body works, discovering how their emotions work. This imputing of maliciousness, which really doesn't actually happen. There isn't a malicious intent among children generally. There are, of course, biological abnormalities with brain, actual structure dysfunction where a kid just, is acting out in response to hormones or imbalances of chemicals. That's a different issue, and that requires its own specialized science and knowledge. But by and large, your typical child is not acting out of this, evil intent of doing wrong based on their own ethical compass, saying I'm going to do harm to others. It comes through the parenting, the environment, the diet, the other things that a child is ingesting, whether that's music or media. You have to be conscious as a parent what's going into your kid's mind and what they're being exposed to, because if you're not, and you're not asking the right questions and not being empathetic, then you're going to miss out on many causation, and you're going to end up chalking it up to malicious intent or something that it's really not, when it's your child responding to some other stimuli or trying to get their wants or needs met, but not being able to fully articulate that yet because they need to have that empathetic communication from a parent. So, if you can get past these points of all or nothing thinking, which is a big stumbling block for a lot of people, they immediately say, you just want, neglect, and you just want kids to just do whatever they want, and, enabling them, which is just not the case. It's not the case whatsoever. When you're a peaceful parent, you still set healthy boundaries. You don't say, just because your kid wants to eat donuts all night, that you're going to go buy donuts. You can set those healthy boundaries and not do those things that might be unhealthy for your child. But really what this boils down to is being able to think clearly about how you want to raise your child with an ethical, reasoned mindset, one that's built on empathy and communication. And that takes hard work. It takes self-knowledge work from the individual, which is why parents themselves have to also reflect on their own childhood and be self-aware and constantly self-monitoring of how they're presenting what they're saying to their kids, because if you don't do that, you're very likely going to end up repeating or rationalizing hurts from the past and your own wants or needs, and those not being met. You might push that onto your kids and say things or do things that are harmful toward them. And I know that a lot of the things that I've spoken to so far have kind of like a high-level view or words that you might be familiar with, but I do have some links down below that clearly articulate some of the finer things that I'm speaking to, with examples, situational analysis, different types of examples of real world parenting things, real communication conflicts and things like that, because it takes time to actually sit there and kind of develop your own sense of how you speak to others. It takes time to actually work through and think about your own weaknesses. And I know that firsthand because I grew up with physical violence, with abuse. I know what it's like. I rationalized it too later in life. I was like, well, here I am today, and that's how I got to be. It's okay. And it took time for me to sit back and say, okay, that wasn't the best way to have done things. The violence was not necessary to learn, and I could have been treated a different way, but my parents didn't have those tools, and that's okay to recognize that. A lot of this is about ethical evolution and learning. You don't get to be a better person by remaining in a state of ignorance about yourself. You're only going to grow if you take the time to say, okay, I want to learn new things, I want to explore, and I want to challenge myself. So you have to have that mindset. You have to have that growth mindset, or you're not going to be the peaceful parent you want to be for your kids. You're not going to be there in a way that creates that new, instead of cycle of violence, cycle of peace. You have to start with that change within yourself. And when you do that, you're going to reap the rewards. A lot of people will still excuse spanking, right? Even if it doesn't work the first time, right? They'll be like, oh, well, the spanking didn't work the first time, but I'm going to spank again and it'll work this time. So people will make that excuse there, but they won't make that excuse for peaceful tactics. They won't make that excuse there to say, well, the peaceful tactic didn't work the first time. I guess I'll just give up and go back to spanking, right? So you have to kind of step back from that mindset of wanting to easily give in and be long-term oriented and work hard at developing that kind of negotiation communication with your children. And it's just worth it. It's one of those things where if you really care about the mental well-being, the intellectual faculties, your reasoning ability of your kid, if you want your child to be peaceful, to respect the bodies and properties of others when they grow up, to be empathetic, to be able to ask questions and kind of understand others better and express themselves more effectively, you have to be that role model. You have to do that, and as early as possible, of course. And unfortunately, some people, they've already have years of hurts or abuse or spankings or threats or yelling and frustrations behind them, but there are ways to overcome that as well. And again, you can read about that in the resources below about how to introduce these things, because it might be shocking for some people, their families. They're like, it's weird to see them not yelling anymore or not being quick to grab a belt. It's shocking for people, and they don't know how to take it at first. But if you're consistent with it and commit to it, you're going to see a change for peace that's lasting, that goes much more beyond the short-term orientation of, well, let me just hit and get them to be quiet and see, look, they're well behaved, everybody, they're not like those brats over there and those little pieces of crap kids over there, which I see that from so many parents. It shocks me that they have such a denigrating idea about other little kids. It just boggles my mind. But I remember these are people who heard those same things about them when they were younger. They were people who were shamed and abused as a kid. They are projecting the hurts that they had because that was what was told to them, and they were told that they were worthless, that they need to shut up because somebody else with authority knows what's best, and they'll hit them in their mouth, they'll hit them on their butt if they talk back or something of that nature. And it's just it's a sad cycle, but it can be broken. So I hope that kind of helps somewhat flesh out some of these finer details of where people kind of lose the concept of peaceful parenting because they're so used to going to one direction or the other. And if you have any questions or anything like that about it, just hit me up in the comments so we could talk about it. My experiences with using some of these things and understanding them comes from just my own family, my own home life, working with kids. I worked with them in a variety of contexts as a juvenile defense attorney, as a teacher. That's an ethical environment. That's its own unethical environment. But I definitely know, and have seen the issues arise. And I've worked with kids as a tutor and their families, helping them be better communicators with their kids as well, in terms of just pure communication tactics. It's a real thing, and it really can change your life and your family's life for the better. So hopefully that helps, and I will talk to y'all later.